Hi, my name is Josh, and this is the debater/judge briefing for the 2017 United States Universities Debating Championships in Denver, Colorado. It is the expectation of the adjudication corps for this year that all of the judges will watch this before the tournament, and it would probably be a good idea for debaters to watch it as well to help them prepare for the competition. This is meant as a guide for participants who already have an understanding of British parliamentary debate. We will be linking a novice briefing in the description below for anyone who is looking for more basic information. The purpose of this briefing is to strive for consistency in the judging pool. To that end, we will be providing generally accepted norms for each of the positions in a British parliamentary debate round, as well as suggestions for approaching adjudication. To be clear, these are not set rules, which means that debaters can choose not to follow them. Although if they do, they should probably include their reasoning for not doing so in their speech. If this happens, judges should not automatically discredit the team for their decision, and the other teams in the round would do well to engage with the reasoning behind the decision. However, the vast majority of cases should follow along with what we outline in this presentation, and you can't really go wrong by making decisions based on the suggestions that we have provided here. Remember that in a British parliamentary debate round, speaker roles are assigned to ensure fairness among the four teams, and deviating from these roles can imbalance the debate. Keeping that in mind, it is good to ensure the decisions you make are looking to improve the quality of the debate and not to find some sneaky way to put other teams at a strategic disadvantage and as a result trying to steal a win. Following this golden rule will guarantee that your judges and the other teams in the round don't hate you. Preparation time starts immediately after the release of the motion and lasts for 15 minutes. During this time, you are not allowed to talk to anyone other than your debate partner. This includes other teammates, coaches, and the team on the same side of the bench as you. You are not allowed to use electronic devices to access information. The only exception is electronic translators in the case that a team does not speak English as their primary language. You are allowed to use printed materials, such as magazines or news articles you have printed out, but they cannot be brought to the podium at the time of your actual speech. The basic role of the opening government is to define the round. A few notes on that. When deciding where to place the debate, do not assume the motion is set inside of the United States unless that is specifically stated. A motion might also designate alternative specific placements for the round. Barring that, it is generally a good idea to apply the motion as broadly as possible. One frequently used setting for many topics is Western liberal democracies. Keeping in line with this, oftentimes there is not one uniform status quo that the teams will be accepting or rejecting. It can be useful to identify the appropriate state of affairs that you will be referencing in any particular argument to ensure all of the teams are on the same page. Regardless of the placement of the debate, the opening government is granted fiat power, meaning they can assume that motion or model they defend will in fact come into existence. What that means is that it is not a valid argument for opposition teams to say, for example, we oppose this motion because there is no way that Republicans in Congress would ever pass a bill of this nature. Opening government teams are not, however, allowed to fiat the manner in which their proposal will be received. Therefore, it would be valid for opening opposition to talk about potential backlash that would come about from the various parties upon the passing of that bill. It is not necessary to include a model in every round as opening government. Some motions might be set as primarily principled discussions, while others could be specific enough on their own so as not to necessitate further elaboration of a policy. That being said, as an opening government team, it is your prerogative to decide whether or not the round needs further clarity beyond the motion that you would like to provide through the creation of a model. In the example of, this House believes that the Sith Lord's use of the Force as an interrogation technique is legitimate, it would be perfectly fine for an opening government to set up a principled debate based exclusively on the information provided in the motion. In our second example, this House believes that the Rebel Alliance should provide primitive races military technology to aid in the fight against the Empire. The motion also provides enough information to have a good debate without the opening government adding a policy. However, an opening government team would be well within their rights to introduce a policy defining what sorts of military technology that they would provide, and the ways in which they think that technology should be used to overthrow the evil empire. Be aware that whether choosing to provide a specific plan or not, you are taking on different burdens. A debate round with too little direction generally comes back to punish opening government teams, whereas a team providing a very specific model means taking on the burden of defending your policy as well as the motion. Something that you definitely want to avoid as an opening government team is challengeable definitions. There are typically three types of challengeable definitions: a squirrel, a truism or tautology, or a time-place set. A squirrel is a defining of the round in a way that clearly does not follow the spirit of the motion. Given this house would not have allowed Harry Potter to compete in the Triwizard Games, an opening government defining the debate as kicking Harry off of the Quidditch team would be squirreling. Setting a truism or tautology would be defining the debate in such a way that opposition teams would have to argue against something that is essentially not disputable. Providing a definition that Harry Potter should love his mother on the motion of this house believes that love is the most powerful magic of all would be considered a challengeable definition for this reason. A time-place set moves the round to an unfairly convenient location for the opening government team. Telling the adjudicators that we should celebrate the legacy of Snape, but only after Book 8, when we realize Dumbledore's murder was only a dream, is an example of a time-place set. Moving on to opening opposition. Typically, the first thing that an opening opposition team wants to do is choose a general stance to take in the round. The vast majority of opposition stances will take on some form of the following three choices. They could defend the status quo, try to prove that the government side makes things worse, and or provide an alternative. To defend the status quo is to say you like things the way that they are and that any change would be undesirable. Alternatively, you could agree that the status quo might not be great, but that the government teams would only be making things worse. An opposition team does not have to prove that they can fix the status quo in order to win the debate. But in a 4-team format, a closing team that is able to show how that is possible when their opening team did not could very likely earn a higher ranking. In an effort to provide their own solution to the problems of the status quo, opposition teams might provide an alternative known as a counterprop. If you decide to run a counterprop as opening opposition, there are a few things to keep in mind. A counterprop must be mutually exclusive with the government's case or model. If not, then the government side can simply agree to also enact the exact same policy, resulting in no differentiation between the teams. It must also defend the opposition side's philosophy in the debate. It is not legitimate for opposition to defend the principles of the government side of the motion simply by tweaking a few mechanisms of the government's model. If you do decide to run a counterprop, then you take on the same burdens as running a model from opening government that we covered in previous slides. If, by some chance, the opening government defines the debate in a challengeable manner, as outlined in previous slides, the leader of opposition, and only the leader of opposition, has the option to challenge that definition. If you do decide to challenge an opening government's definition, you must clearly state that you are in fact challenging, tell the adjudicator which of the three reasons you are giving, and then provide a fair government side definition. You then attack that definition rather than the one provided by the opening government and proceed to give your case as normal. If your challenge is legitimate, the rest of the debate will carry on based on your new definition. Please note that this is something that is very, very rare, occurring in less than 1% of debates. Also, if you enact this option abusively, the debate is guaranteed to be horrible, and the judges will hate you for wasting an hour of their life. Decide accordingly. Shifting to the bottom half of the debate. The primary role of both of the closing teams in a British parliamentary debate round is to provide an extension. This should come in the member speech, and there are multiple things that can constitute a legitimate extension. The best choice for an extension is to provide completely new argumentation to the debate. However, it is also legitimate to take arguments of your opening team and expand them or apply them to a different location or group of people. You could also analyze material that has already been introduced by your opening in a different way. Finally, it is often the case that positive material is embedded inside of arguments that are used primarily as rebuttal. This means that it is possible for contributions coming in the form of rebuttal to qualify as an extension. Note that simply having an extension does not mean that you have beaten your opening team. It simply means that you have fulfilled your main burden as a closing team. In order to rank higher than your opening, the quality of the material in that extension must be high enough to compensate for the advantage of having heard your opening team's arguments first, listening to the opposition's responses to them, and having essentially another half hour of prep time before presenting your own. In general, closing teams should strive for consistency with their opening. One way of thinking about this is that the arguments of the closing team need to be able to exist at the same time as the arguments outlined by their opening. They cannot be mutually exclusive. A couple of exceptions to this are if the opening team contradicted themselves. In this instance, you can choose which of the two opening speakers you want to stay consistent with. Or, if the opening team is just factually incorrect, you are not expected to maintain a line of argument based on completely erroneous information. In general, you are not allowed to knife your opening team. Other than in the exceptions listed, this would be providing argumentation that is not compatible with the line taken by your opening or outright contradicting them. Moving from the member speakers to the whips. Whip speeches are designated as the summary speeches for the round. Your job is to go over the important aspects of the debate in a manner that shows the judge that your team has won the round. During the course of the summary, the opposition whip is not allowed to introduce new material to the debate. This would be any line of argumentation that cannot be attached to something that has already been said in the round. If the opposition whip does introduce new material to the round, adjudicators should not explicitly punish the speaker, but should also not take that material into consideration when deciding rankings for the debate. The speaker will punish themselves by wasting valuable time during their speech. As government whip, you are allowed to introduce new material, but must keep in mind that your primary role is to summarize an hour-long debate in 7 minutes. You will have to decide whether or not giving up some of that time to bring up an entirely new point will be worth it. POIs. Each speaker in the debate will be expected to take at least one POI, with a good rule of thumb being each team taking 3 total between the two speakers. Strive to accept at least one POI from each of the teams across from you. Failure to do this can be seen as a lack of engagement by the judges, especially when it is a closing team that is locking out an opening team. This can lead to the judge thinking you are scared of the opening team's response to whatever argument you happen to be presenting. In rounds where rankings are tight, this could potentially result in the opening team being given the benefit of the doubt that they had a solid counter to your point, and them placing higher than you. It is better to take their POI and respond to it to remove any doubt as to whether they could defeat your case or not. When you accept a POI, you are yielding the floor for 15 seconds. That means that you are not allowed to interrupt the speaker offering the point when you think that you have, I got it. If they reach the 15-second mark, the chair should call time on them. Moving on to adjudication. Please judge the round that actually happened in front of you. This means not punishing teams for failing to run the arguments that you would have liked to see, or debating in a manner differently than you would have. It is legitimate for a judge to identify specific burdens that teams need to meet based on the motion or the round, but it is not legitimate to rank them lower for meeting those burdens in a way you might not have chosen. Alternatively, don't give teams more credit than they deserve either. Try not to reconstruct arguments more completely than they were actually made in the round, or fill in gaps in logic that the teams missed. When you have been involved in the activity for a long time, it can be easy to hear a tagline or phrase and immediately fill in the argument that is supposed to follow. A debater saying the words self-actualization is not the same as explaining what that is, why it matters, and how it can be achieved in this particular debate, even if as a judge, you could answer all of those questions on your own. This is not to say that as a judge, you are an entirely blank slate. The general rule of thumb is that an adjudicator should operate as an average reasonable voter. This means that you do not necessarily have to give credit to an argument simply for going unrebutted. If there is a logical flaw in the argument, this would render that argument unpersuasive on face for an average reasonable voter. Similarly, if you are offered a straightforward factual error, you are within your rights to discredit it regardless of whether or not it is responded to. This might not apply to situations where you are an expert in that particular field. If you are a nuclear physicist and a team erroneously identifies the atomic weight of plutonium, remembering the average reasonable voter standard, this would not be a situation in which you would impose yourself in the round. In instances where you do step in for valid reasons, generally you would simply not assign credit to the team making that particular argument for that portion of their speech. You would not actively detract from their score because of it. Similar to new material in an opposition whip speech, they will be punishing themselves by inefficient allocation of their limited speaking time. After the round, the panel will begin the process of deliberation in an attempt to reach consensus decision on their rankings. Keep in mind that this is not a competition. It is meant to be a cooperative activity where judges help each other come to the best possible adjudication. Deliberation will typically begin with each judge providing their initial rankings, although oftentimes you might not have set rankings immediately coming out of the debate. This does not mean that it should be your goal to beat your fellow adjudicators over the head with your rankings. They should simply serve as a starting point for the discussion. It is not a sign of weakness, and you will rarely receive poor feedback for shifting your initial rankings in your final decision. That being said, the point of consensus deliberation is to take potentially differing initial decisions to ensure the highest quality set of rankings in the end. Do not just roll over and concede to judges who might have differing opinions, as the process will lose out on feedback that you might have provided. At this tournament, we will be allocating 15 minutes per round for deliberation. In order to achieve this efficiently, without sacrificing the quality of the final rankings, it can be a good idea to try and find common ground amongst the judges and work from there. Provided is an example of 3 judges' initial rankings coming out of the round. In this particular case, it would probably be a good strategy to talk through the closing opposition, who has 2/4 and a third, then the opening government, with 2/1 and a second, and then spend the majority of the time on the split between opening opposition and closing government. Keep in mind, though, the discussion on tight positions might lead to a changing in rankings that the panel had previously thought decided. Even when rankings seem unanimous, the teams still deserve the judges taking time to talk through their positions and double-check their initial thoughts. It can be useful to have a member of the panel play devil's advocate and argue on behalf of different rankings. If after 15 minutes, no consensus can be reached, the chair will have to initiate a vote. If the panel happens to be even-numbered and there is a tie, the chair will cast the deciding vote. If you are the chair, you cannot, however, overrule your panelists if you end up in the minority decision. In the instances where the chair is dissenting, a panelist will typically provide the verbal adjudication for the split rankings. When providing verbal adjudication, please offer comparative analysis. The teams were competing against each other throughout the debate, not offering isolated speeches. Avoid explaining why teams were good or bad in favor of showing how they were better or worse than the other teams in the round. It might be useful to spend more time explaining the distinctions between tighter positions, but don't ignore providing reasoning for rankings that you felt were obvious. Finally, separate from the explanation for the actual rankings, it is useful to provide the debaters suggestions for improvement. Try to keep these separate from the reasoning for the decision so that debaters know you are not stepping into the round and punishing them for not doing the thing that you might have done in their shoes. Being an adjudicator simply means that your job for the weekend is to decide the rankings for the teams who are competing. It does not mean that you are better or smarter than them. Please provide your feedback in a manner recognizing this. Similarly, for teams, most judges at a tournament are there volunteering their time, and the competition could not function without them. For every bad adjudication that you've had to sit through, there is a judge who had to listen to a bad speech of yours. You feeling as though a panel came to the wrong decision is not a reason to treat them as a bad person any more than you giving an off speech makes you deserving of criticism. A final note on bias. As an adjudicator, please strive not to preference teams based on the motion or position that they were placed in. Remember that teams are randomly allocated positions and do their best to defend those positions regardless of whether or not they, or you, personally agree with that particular stance. Also try to check back against other biases influencing your decision. This can include speaking style, not preferencing a fancy-sounding accent, or punishing a speaker for a high-pitched voice. Not detracting from one speech because it sounds bitchy to you, while rewarding another for being authoritative. There are also differences in approaches to the activity based on a debater's background in various formats or geographical locations. If, for example, you prefer predominantly practical argumentation, that is not a reason to award a poor example of a practical case the win over a well-thought-out and impacted principle case. Try to reward the teams that offer the highest quality version of the style of speech that they have chosen to run, not the team that simply does what you were hoping to hear. If you have any questions on this briefing, please feel free to email us. Our email address for this tournament is denveradgecore2017@gmail.com.